The morning sun had barely crested the maple trees when the first hazmat truck rounded the corner of Elm Street, its yellow lights flashing like a beacon of doom. Sarah Martinez clutched her coffee mug tighter as she watched through her kitchen window, the ceramic handle growing slick with her sweating palms. The truck's engine growled to a stop, followed immediately by another, then another, until the entire street looked like a scene from a disaster movie. "Mom, what's happening?" Her 12-year-old daughter Emma appeared at her elbow, still in her pajamas, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that children should never have to experience. Sarah didn't have an answer. 20 minutes ago, their neighborhood had been the picture of suburban tranquility. The Hendersons were walking their golden retriever. Mr. Chen was watering his prize-winning roses. The Williams children were setting up their weekly lemonade stand in their front yard, their wheelchairs positioned carefully behind the small wooden table they'd painted bright yellow just last weekend. Now, men in full protective suits were unrolling barrier tape across the street, their movements sharp and urgent. A van with Channel 7 News emblazoned on its side screeched to a halt at the police barricade, and a reporter with perfectly styled hair jumped out, already speaking into her microphone. "This is Rebecca Chang, reporting live from Elm Street, where authorities have cordoned off an entire residential block following reports of a potential toxic gas leak. Residents are being evacuated immediately as hazmat teams investigate what officials are calling a serious environmental threat." Sarah's phone buzzed with the emergency alert she'd been dreading. "Immediate evacuation required. Chemical hazard detected. Leave area now." The chaos that followed would haunt the residents of Elm Street for months to come. Families poured from their homes with whatever they could carry, children crying, pets barking, elderly neighbors leaning on walkers as they shuffled toward the evacuation buses. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down cradled her diabetic cat against her chest, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "23 years I've lived here," she whispered to no one in particular. 23 years. But 12 hours earlier, none of this madness existed. Elm Street had been preparing for what the Williams family hoped would be their most successful fundraising day yet. Tommy Williams, age 10, had been born with spina bifida, but his infectious smile and boundless enthusiasm made him the unofficial mayor of their small neighborhood. His older sister Lucy, 13, and navigating life with cerebral palsy, possessed a sharp wit that could make adults laugh until their sides hurt. Together, they'd been running their lemonade stand every Saturday for 3 months, raising money for the children's hospital that had become their second home. "Remember, Tommy, we need to make sure everyone gets exactly the right amount of ice," Lucy had instructed her brother as they set up their stand that Friday afternoon, preparing for the next day's event. Her speech took effort, each word carefully formed, but her determination was unmistakable. I know, and we have to smile really big when people give us money for the hospital kids," Tommy replied, practicing his customer service grin. Their mother, Janet Williams, watched from the front porch with the kind of pride that fills a parent's chest until it might burst. After years of doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, and fighting insurance companies, seeing her children focused on helping others felt like a miracle. The neighborhood had embraced the kids' project wholeheartedly. Even crotchety Mr. Patterson bought lemonade twice a week, claiming it was the best he'd ever tasted. All the neighbors supported the stand. That is, except for Karen Blackwood. Karen had moved to Elm Street 8 months ago, purchasing the imposing brick house at the end of the block with cash from her recent divorce settlement. She was the kind of woman who measured her grass with a ruler and called the city if her neighbor's trash can remained visible past noon on collection day. Her silver BMW sat in her driveway, like a monument to her superiority. Always perfectly clean. always parked at the exact center of her driveway. From the moment the Williams children had started their lemonade stand, Karen had made her displeasure known. She'd complained to Janet about the excessive noise of children laughing. She'd photographed cars parked along the street, claiming they were blocking her mailbox access. She'd even called the city to inquire about permit requirements for the stand, hoping to shut it down on a technicality. "Those kids are a disturbance to the peace," she'd told anyone who would listen. "This is a residential neighborhood, not a commercial district." But her complaints had fallen on deaf ears. The neighbors loved Tommy and Lucy, and the city had confirmed that their small operation was perfectly legal. Karen's frustration had been building like pressure in a kettle, and, on that fateful Friday evening, it finally reached its breaking point. The incident began at 6:47 p.m., according to the official timeline that would later be scrutinized by lawyers and journalists. Karen had been working in her garden when she heard the children's voices carrying across the yard as they prepared for the next day. Their excitement about potentially raising enough money for a new wheelchair-accessible playground had reached a crescendo, and their joyful chatter apparently proved too much for Karen's tolerance. What she did next would shock even those who knew her best. Karen marched into her house, grabbed her cell phone, and dialed 911. 911. "What's your emergency?" "I need to report a toxic gas leak on Elm Street," Karen said, her voice steady and convincing. "There's a strong chemical smell coming from the Williams house. I think it might be dangerous. My eyes are burning, and I'm having trouble breathing." The dispatcher's training kicked in immediately. Reports of gas leaks triggered automatic emergency protocols. Within minutes, fire trucks, hazmat teams, and emergency medical services were racing toward Elm Street. But Karen wasn't finished. She called back 20 minutes later, this time reporting that the smell was getting stronger and that she'd seen suspicious activity around the children's lemonade stand setup. "I think they might have spilled something dangerous," she lied smoothly. "There are containers everywhere, and the smell is definitely coming from that direction." The authorities had no choice but to treat her report as credible. By morning, the evacuation was in full swing. As families loaded their belongings into cars and emergency buses, the media circus grew larger by the hour. News vans from 3 different stations parked along the barricade. Reporters thrust microphones at confused residents, asking them to describe the toxic smell that many admitted they'd never actually noticed. "It's terrifying," one neighbor told Channel 7, clearly shaken by the morning's events. "We trust this neighborhood. We raise our children here. To think there could have been poison in the air." The story went viral within hours. Social media exploded with posts about the Elm Street toxic crisis. Local news stations ran continuous coverage, interviewing environmental experts who speculated about possible sources of contamination. National news picked up the story by evening, with headlines reading, "Suburban neighborhood evacuated due to mystery chemical leak." The Williams family found themselves at the center of unwanted attention. Reporters camped outside the hotel where evacuated families were staying, bombarding them with questions about their children's activities. Was the lemonade stand involved in the contamination? One journalist asked Janet Williams, her microphone inches from Janet's face. "My children were raising money for charity," Janet replied, her voice thick with exhaustion and stress. "They're good kids. They would never hurt anyone." But the damage was already spreading beyond the immediate crisis. Real estate vultures began circling within 48 hours of the evacuation. Companies with names like Quick Cash Properties and Fast Home Solutions started making calls to the displaced families, offering to buy their homes at drastically reduced prices. "We understand you're in a difficult situation," the smooth-talking representatives would say. With the contamination issues, it might be years before you can safely return. We can offer you cash now, help you start over somewhere else. Some families, overwhelmed by uncertainty and mounting hotel bills, began to consider these offers. The Pattersons, both in their 70s, were particularly vulnerable. Maybe it's time to move to Florida anyway, Mr. Patterson told his wife as they sat in their cramped hotel room, surrounded by the few possessions they'd managed to grab during the evacuation. Meanwhile, the investigation was revealing troubling inconsistencies. The EPA team, led by Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, had been conducting air quality tests around the clock. Their sophisticated equipment, capable of detecting even trace amounts of chemical contamination, had found nothing. "We've tested every possible source," Dr. Rodriguez explained to the incident commander on day 3 of the crisis. "Air samples, soil samples, water samples, everything is coming back clean. Whatever was reported, it's not showing up in our readings." The incident commander, Fire Chief Patricia Moore, frowned at the preliminary reports. Could the source have been neutralized somehow? Maybe washed away by rain? "There hasn't been any rain," Dr. Rodriguez pointed out, "and most chemicals leave residual traces even after dilution. We're not finding anything that would cause the symptoms described in the original reports." That's when Dr. Rodriguez decided to interview the complainant directly. Karen Blackwood answered her door on Thursday morning with the demeanor of a woman who'd been through a terrible ordeal. She wore a surgical mask and kept a tissue pressed to her nose, occasionally coughing for emphasis. "I'm so glad you're taking this seriously," she told Dr. Rodriguez. "I've been monitoring the air quality myself with my own equipment, and the readings have been alarming." Dr. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "You have air quality monitoring equipment?" "Of course," Karen replied. "I'm very concerned about environmental safety. I can show you my readings if you'd like." She led him to her home office, where a small device sat on her desk next to her computer. It looked like a standard indoor air quality monitor, the kind available at electronics stores for measuring humidity and basic particulates. "This showed dangerous levels of toxic compounds starting Friday evening," Karen explained, pointing to a handwritten logbook. "See here, the readings spiked right around the time I first called 911. Dr. Rodriguez examined the device and the logbook with growing skepticism. The monitor was designed for basic home use, not detecting the kinds of toxic chemicals that would require a hazmat response. Moreover, the readings Karen had recorded were inconsistent with the device's actual capabilities. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said carefully, "this device can't actually detect most toxic gases. It measures basic air quality indicators like dust and humidity." Karen's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Well, it definitely showed something was wrong. Maybe it detected secondary effects." But Dr. Rodriguez was no longer listening to her explanations. He was staring at her computer screen, where she'd accidentally left open a browser window. The search history was visible, showing a series of queries from the previous Friday. How to report gas leak. Emergency services response time. What triggers hazmat team? And most damning of all, how long does evacuation last for chemical spill? The searches were time-stamped. Every single one had been conducted before Karen's first call to 911. "Mrs. Blackwood," Dr. Rodriguez said slowly, "I think we need to have a more detailed conversation." Within hours, the truth began to unravel. Faced with concrete evidence of her premeditation, Karen's story collapsed like a house of cards. She'd never smelled any toxic gases. She'd never experienced any symptoms. The entire crisis had been fabricated as revenge against the Williams children and their lemonade stand. "I just wanted them to stop," she finally admitted to investigators. "The noise, the cars, the disruption to the neighborhood. I never thought it would get so out of hand." But the damage was already done. Families had been displaced for 5 days. Businesses along the evacuation route had lost thousands of dollars in revenue. The city had spent over $200,000 on emergency response. Most heartbreaking of all, Tommy and Lucy Williams had watched news reports suggesting that their innocent fundraising efforts might have somehow caused a community crisis. "We just wanted to help sick kids," Tommy had sobbed to his mother on Tuesday night. "Did we do something wrong?" The revelation of Karen's lies ignited a firestorm of public outrage that made the initial media coverage look tame by comparison. The story of a woman who'd fabricated a toxic emergency to silence disabled children resonated far beyond their small community. Social media exploded with expressions of support for the Williams family and condemnation of Karen's actions. Local news stations, embarrassed by their role in amplifying the false story, began investigating how they'd been misled. The real estate companies that had circled like vultures found themselves under scrutiny for their predatory tactics. City officials promised a full review of emergency response protocols to prevent similar hoaxes in the future. But it was at the emergency town hall meeting, hastily organized for the following Saturday, that the community truly came together to confront what had happened to them. The high school gymnasium was packed beyond capacity. Families who'd been evacuated sat alongside neighbors who'd watched helplessly from beyond the police barriers. City officials, EPA representatives, and media personnel filled the back rows. The air hummed with tension and barely contained anger. Mayor Jennifer Walsh opened the meeting with an apology. "Our community has been through an unthinkable ordeal," she began. "We trusted information that proved to be false, and that trust cost real families real hardship. We owe it to everyone affected to make this right." One by one, residents stood to share their experiences. Mrs. Patterson described sleeping in a hotel bed for 5 nights, wondering if she'd ever see her garden again. The Chen family talked about their teenage son missing college admission interviews because they'd been displaced. Small business owners calculated losses from the economic disruption. Then, Janet Williams approached the microphone, her children flanking her on either side. Tommy sat tall in his wheelchair, while Lucy stood with her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. "We moved to this neighborhood because we thought it was a place where our children could grow up safely," Janet said, her voice clear and strong despite the emotion underlying her words. Tommy and Lucy wanted to raise money for other kids who were fighting medical battles. They believed in the goodness of their community. She paused, looking around the packed gymnasium. What happened this week wasn't about toxic gas or environmental hazards. It was about one person's inability to accept children with disabilities as valuable members of our community. It was about someone who saw my kids' joy and decided it was a threat that needed to be eliminated. The silence in the gymnasium was deafening. "But I want you all to know," Janet continued, "that my children still believe in this community. They still want to help other kids. And they still think their neighbors are good people who were deceived by someone they trusted." Tommy reached for the microphone, and his mother lowered it to his level. "We forgive everybody," he said, his young voice carrying across the packed room. "Even the lady who lied. But we hope she learns that lying hurts people." The applause started slowly, then built into a thunderous ovation that lasted several minutes. People were crying, hugging, reaching out to touch the Williams family as they made their way back to their seats. But the evening's most dramatic moment came when Karen Blackwood herself entered the gymnasium. She'd been released on bail that morning, facing charges of filing false police reports, public endangerment, and fraud. Her lawyer had undoubtedly advised her to stay away from any public gatherings, but something had compelled her to come. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Angry voices rose throughout the gymnasium. "Get out!" someone shouted. "You don't belong here," called another. Mayor Walsh called for order, but the tension was palpable. Karen stood near the back of the room, her face pale, her hands shaking visibly. Then, surprising everyone, Tommy Williams called out from his seat near the front. "Let her talk." The gymnasium fell silent again. All eyes turned to the 10-year-old boy who'd been at the center of the crisis. "She should get to say she's sorry if she wants to," Tommy said simply. "That's what people do when they make mistakes." Karen walked slowly to the microphone, each step echoing in the hushed space. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I am sorry," she whispered, then cleared her throat and tried again. "I am deeply, profoundly sorry for what I've done to this community, to the families who were displaced, to the children whose fundraiser I tried to destroy." Her voice broke, and she paused to compose herself. "I was angry about things that don't matter. I was small, and petty, and cruel. I let my own unhappiness poison me against children who were trying to help others." She looked directly at Tommy and Lucy Williams. "You two are better people at your ages than I've ever been in my entire life. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope someday you'll believe that I truly understand how wrong I was." Karen left the gymnasium without waiting for a response, but her admission of guilt and responsibility marked a turning point in the community's healing process. The legal consequences for Karen were swift and severe. She pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 6 months in jail, 3 years of probation, and restitution payments totaling over $300,000 to cover emergency response costs and compensation for displaced families. Her house went up for sale immediately to cover the financial penalties. The civil lawsuits filed by affected families resulted in additional settlements that essentially bankrupted her. But perhaps more significantly, she was required to perform 500 hours of community service specifically with organizations serving children with disabilities. The Williams family received something far more valuable than money. However, the story of their grace under pressure and their children's resilience in the face of discrimination had touched hearts across the country. Donations poured in from around the world for their hospital fundraising efforts, ultimately raising over $100,000 for children's medical care. Major media outlets featured their story as an example of how communities can come together after crisis. Tommy and Lucy were invited to speak at disability rights conferences and were honored by the governor with the state's Youth Humanitarian Award. But the most meaningful recognition came from their own neighborhood. When the families returned to Elm Street after the all-clear was given, they found that their neighbors had organized a massive welcome home celebration centered around the largest lemonade stand anyone had ever seen. Every family on the block had contributed supplies, decorations, and time to create a fundraising event that stretched along 3 city blocks. The city had closed the street to traffic for the day, and vendors had set up booths selling everything from cotton candy to handmade crafts, with all proceeds going to the Children's Hospital Fund. "Welcome home, heroes," read a giant banner stretched across the street. Local high school students had painted faces, a clown made balloon animals, and the fire department brought a truck for children to explore. Tommy and Lucy sat behind their original yellow table, now decorated with ribbons and balloons. serving lemonade to a line of customers that seemed to stretch for miles. Their smiles were radiant, their joy infectious, their faith in their community completely restored. "You know what, Lucy," Tommy said to his sister, as they watched their neighbors celebrating around them, "I think we live in the best place in the whole world." Lucy nodded, carefully counting the money in their donation jar. "Yeah, Tommy, and you know what else? I think people are mostly good, even when they make really big mistakes." As the sun set over Elm Street that evening, families gathered in their yards to watch the cleanup crew dismantle the celebration. Children ran between houses, playing games that had been interrupted by the week's crisis. Adults lingered in small groups, sharing stories and reconnecting after their shared ordeal. The crisis had tested their community in ways they'd never imagined, but it had also revealed strengths they hadn't known they possessed. They'd learned about the power of fear to divide people and the greater power of truth to bring them back together. They'd witnessed how quickly trust could be shattered and how patiently it had to be rebuilt. Most importantly, they'd been reminded that their community's greatest treasures weren't their property values or their peaceful streets, but their children and their commitment to protecting and nurturing them, especially those who needed extra support and care. The Williams family's lemonade stand continued every Saturday, but now it was part of a larger community tradition. Other families organized monthly fundraising events, and the neighborhood became known throughout the city for its charitable efforts and its inclusion of residents with disabilities. Karen Blackwood never returned to Elm Street after her release from jail, but those who encountered her during her community service hours reported that she seemed genuinely changed by her experience. She worked quietly and diligently, never seeking attention or praise, apparently focused on learning from the children she'd once tried to silence. The story of the Elm Street crisis became a case study in crisis communication, community resilience, and the importance of verifying information before acting on it. But for the residents who lived through it, it remained simply the week when they discovered what their community was truly made of. Years later, when Tommy and Lucy Williams had grown up and moved on to college and careers, they would still return every summer to help run the annual Elm Street Community Festival. The event had grown into one of the city's largest charitable fundraisers, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars for various causes while celebrating the diversity and strength of their neighborhood. And every year, without fail, someone would tell the story of the toxic lie that had once threatened to destroy their community, and how two children with disabilities had led them back to the truth about what really mattered in life: kindness, honesty, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the whole world seems to be against you. The yellow lemonade stand, now permanently mounted in the community park, bore a small plaque that read, "In memory of a crisis that taught us the difference between real danger and imagined threats, and in honor of two children who showed us how to choose love over fear." Tommy and Lucy Williams had set out to raise money for sick children. Instead, they'd raised the consciousness of an entire community and proven that sometimes the smallest voices can speak the most powerful truths.